Hi there, and welcome to episode 73 of the Analyst Brief podcast, brought to you by the Cyberhut. My name is Simon Moffatt, founder and analyst at the Cyberhut, and with me as ever is Mr. Co-host, Mr. David Mahdi. David, hi, how are we doing?
Hello, Simon. I'm doing well. And yourself?
Very well, very good. Yeah, cannot complain. It's powering through spring, getting closer to the World Cup for those who are interested in those sorts of things. For my sort of calendar, I have it overlaid with all of the milestones for like England friendly games and squad announcements and this sort of nonsense. So it's we're now in the middle of May nearly, I guess, and we're heading rapidly towards the summer and the World Cup, which is of vital importance, I'm sure, to many of our listeners. But it's going very well.
No. I know it's May. I think we're recording this second week of May at this point now, and I'm just looking at the calendar and thinking, Identiverse is coming up next month, and then we're kind of off into summer. So I can't believe it's already May already, approaching halfway through 2026, and
absolutely.
I think, Simon, there's already been some big news again in the identity space. Surprise, surprise.
Absolutely. Yeah. Look, it's there's news every day on some level, funding rounds, and certainly lots of changes in jobs and C-level changes and other. And one thing we do like to sort of chunter on a little bit about is acquisitions and mergers and funding and what that can possibly mean for the rest of the market. And there's been two acquisitions I want to sort of bring up this week, which have happened the last 10 days or so. And we've touched on acquisitions quite a lot over the past couple of years, and we've seen some interesting trends there. Not just the sort of ping and forge rocks and identity to identity sort of relations. We've seen some interesting orthogonal things happen, like CrowdStrike, ServiceNow, and these sort of guys who, as we've talked about a few times, haven't historically been identity players, but they've either incrementally added in some capabilities or just gone whole hog and spent a few $100 million and sort of augmented themselves in there. And one of those vendors is Cisco. Now, obviously, Cisco, for network stuff, been around for 30 odd years. I did my Cisco exams back in 2005, 2006. I remember failing one of them, actually. It was very hard. I remember that was one you had to you were given some routers and some switches that didn't work essentially, and you had to make them work, and it would record your command line instructions, and every time if you sort of failed to do it, it would sort of work out what you did and should award you some points and stuff. So I do remember failing that exam a long time ago. But obviously the network security world has changed hugely, hasn't it, in the past say 15 years. We've got this concept of cloud, SASE, service edge, software-defined networking, a whole host of things which have changed massively. And it's not like we don't need firewalls. They've just sort of moved where they are. Instead of being a physical PICS thing in a server rack, it's been codified and it's become in data centers and stuff like this. So Cisco has evolved, but they've also dipped their toe in this identity stuff. They bought Duo Security, which seems like a hell of a long time ago now, probably 5 years, 6 years ago, I suppose.
Like 2017, 2018, something like that. It was definitely before COVID.
Okay, fair point. Before and after COVID. So they were obviously looking at the sort of strong auth sort of stuff, MFA capabilities there. And then they added in a few more things. They dipped the toe into the ITDR, ISPM space, and that's been relatively recently rebranded as their identity intelligence sort of platform. And
that was ORT was the big ITDR. That's right.
Foundation there. So they've sort of gone say, well, we've got network, and to make the network work, we're going to look at identity intelligence and tie network access control to MFA, but then look at runtime and hygiene and posture and everything else. So they announced a week or two back that we shared this actually. They announced an acquisition of a company called Asterix Security. So for those who are looking instead of listening, I'm just going to quick share the radar report there. So a company called Asterix Security. So their original focus, essentially AI, non-human world there. And Cisco do a lot of stuff, is is suddenly heading into the NHI and agentic thing? Is it just like is it a cool thing because it's topical and trendy, or do you think it is more strategic around, where Cisco is heading to and what Cisco, I guess what Cisco sort of stand for, if you like, for the next 3 to 4 years? I guess bring you in here, Dave. What's your view on this one? Is it total surprise? Is it just a gimmick? Is it part of a bigger strategy? What's your immediate thoughts?
Yeah, I wasn't surprised. I think that the writing is on the wall as in terms of, and we've had the topic of non-human identity, machine identity that we've been talking about for quite some time. And, when I was at Gartner working with Eric Wallstrom over there, when we pushed to get machine identity defined in this space as like an actual category, we knew these bits and pieces of certificates and APIs and secrets and all these things, they just needed to be managed better. And that was back when we knew there were already cloud use cases and further digital transformation where these identities and key materials would just grow as your digital footprint grows. But obviously AI coming along with now agents and enterprises being pressured to deploy agents for various use cases, which we could speak hours about. I think the writing is on the wall and saying, hey, we need to have identity as the control plane in order to continue on with the evolving human use cases and all the variants of that, the machine identity use cases. So as we mentioned, your secrets, your keys, your tokens, all of that. And that delves into a little bit of posture. And then, of course, agents, right? And so I think that part of it is being visionary and saying, if we have these pieces, and we can't forget they have Splunk, right? So in theory, they have the ability to pull that telemetry and information in. Mm-hmm. There's been a lot of focus in the market, as we've talked about on this podcast, and probably the last several episodes, Simon, on runtime, right? Signal being acquired by CrowdStrike. So part of it too, I see is also defensive. I see it as like visionary, but I see it as defensive because you got Palo Alto, who's made acquisitions, Venafi, CyberArk, of course, and CrowdStrike as well. So we've talked many times on this podcast about the platforms kind of coming in. I think the interesting thing that I've seen some questions come to me directly from practitioners and investors and others in this space and some founders, and they're asking me like, where does that put Okta? Where does that put Savient and SailPoint and your pings and your ForgeRocks? Like, where does that put them? And I think, I'm just seeing this as a huge Venn diagram where everyone's coming at it from different angles, and this AI agent, let's just call it a story or development in the market, is actually forcing them to go, wait a minute, we can't secure agents, especially autonomous agents. And you have to have runtime. You have to have full control and connectivity, and identity is that best control plane in order to do it. Right? Because you can shut off access if you feel like it's doing something very strange, shut off access in runtime, or it shouldn't have access to these keys to the kingdom. So don't even let it access it at all. So that could be a static decision versus dynamic. So I see it as something that is big chunk visionary. I see it as reactionary and defensive. But I do think it was a really good move. And then just on the machine identity and NHI space, together, that was something I think you and I discussed probably about a year ago, because there's a lot of activity around it. Didn't seem like any one machine identity company was, at least in my view, like had enough breadth to be able to take on, these big platform players, because they need the telemetry, they need the data, and they need that kind of control plane spot in an enterprise stack. And I think you've got that in theory with your Crowds, your Palos, and your Ciscos. So I think if Cisco can successfully pull this together and leverage the base that they have with Splunk, I think they've got something very attractive here, where it could take Asterix now and really drive it into a lot of those accounts to open up some new things. So I think it's pretty cool. I'm actually very interested to see where this goes.
Yeah, I think there's some interesting stuff there. you're absolutely right. If you look at the sort of Asterix thing I'm sharing here, the sort of blog, if you
Yeah.
like, on the announcement, they started off, as you said, it was the machine identity thing, API credential sprawl, auth tokens everywhere. So obviously there was that whole issue around, look, we need to amplify this problem via discovery. You need to know what you have in the machine identity NHR workload space first. But really, obviously, that's accelerated hugely this past 2 years around, well, okay, we found everything, and then we add in this agentic stuff. We need to do something about it. We need to control it. We need to look at a whole host of sort of life cycle capabilities for NHIs. And I think there's things in here actually talks about, the sort of discover, govern, and protect sort of lingua franca, which again, back to the things we've talked about, life cycles in the past, from B2E life cycle and the B2C life cycle. Yeah. It's quite easy now to describe the NHI lifecycle. We've got a taxonomy at the Cyberhood, and you say, well, you need to talk about discovery, yes, but you still need governance, lifecycle, auth N, auth Z, monitoring, intelligent analytics, and agentic is slightly different. You need to look at intent, which is I think this is more of a new subcategory, which is emerging on behavior and so on. But they've defined this sort of a good framework, good methodology, which exists amongst several vendors, if you like. And a little bit of fear, why Cisco, why now? It means they can scale, obviously. Now, I think, as always, around this, the blog here talks about the Splunk thing as well. So it's, they've got the secure access, they've got Duo, they've got hundreds and hundreds of thousands of customers globally, all sectors, all geographies. Does that essentially just take Asterix out of competing ultimately and say, right, well, it's going to be essentially fed back into all of Cisco's mid-large accounts? If you're a sales rep, you get this new line item in your SKU list to go and sell stuff, and you've got a reason to go and visit your existing Cisco clients with an account manager and say, look, we've got this NHI stuff now. We're going to give you a discount or whatever. You're an existing customer. We can cross-sell and do NHI discovery for free, and we can then do strategic control of NHI. So I don't know. That would be my strategic view if I was the Cisco head of go-to-market. That would be my immediate thing to do. But so what does that really mean? What does that leave behind? And I think it's back to your point around this sort of platform Venn diagrams. It's becoming really, really congested, isn't it? I mean,
it really is.
Most Cisco customers may well have pick Savient, Savient and CyberArk / Palo Alto. It's quite common if you're a big, large enterprise, 50,000 staff, you're going to probably have some Cisco somewhere, some CyberArk or Palo Alto somewhere. And it's like, well, and maybe a bit of ServiceNow in there. Well, just to, originally it was for your ticketing system or whatever. Now suddenly, because they've all expanded orthogonally, maybe a bit of NHI, a bit of ITDR, a bit of ISPM, a bit of this, a bit of that, they're all actually competing at a whole host of identity control plane points, as you described there. So I'm all for having a bit of sort of overlap, if you like, in the buy side. It's not a bad thing to do for negotiation and for feature redundancy, essentially. So you can swap things out and you have options for certain integration characteristics. But I do wonder if this is getting a little bit too complicated, even for being able to map out a taxonomy and say, well, we've got a Cisco and we've got a SailPoint and we've got a Palo Alto and we've got a Microsoft. What do we do? Who do we use? How does it work? And that to me is becoming a very congested sort of view. And I don't know whether it's more about the features or about how the narrative works, or is it more of like maybe another 2 years this will become more clear? I'm not quite sure.
Yeah. Simon, it's really interesting because just as you were talking, I was just thinking about, building a PC, right? And most motherboards will come with integrated graphics and integrated sound, right? Pretty much almost everything you need. You still need your processor, your RAM, your power supply, all that stuff. But, if you build a PC and you go, I'm going to be a 3D designer, or I want to play hardcore games. Well, you're going to need a really good GPU. You're probably not going to be satisfied with what's on the motherboard, right? And maybe for sound, maybe if you get into sound design or other things, you might need proper, dedicated card to do sound. So very similar, an organization can say, hey, we're going to use one of these platforms because it gets us from 0 to 60, gives us baseline coverage across my cyber stack, including identity, perhaps. And then maybe over time they go, hey, we're in this particular industry, right? We need better functionality here because I don't know, maybe we have more aggressive threats that come to us that are nation state or something else. And so we're going to need something very specific to cover, say, our agents that are doing this stuff. So we're going to need this type of technology. So I still think there's a good medium to perhaps even long-term market need for those niche areas, but that might drive things into the long tail, right? Mm-hmm. Where, hey, large tail, get your big platforms, you got your platforms, you're covered, and then maybe the sophisticated organizations that have the resources, have the budgets, can say, we've got long tail use cases that, based on risk, based on our needs, we might have to do that. Plus also the notion of mergers and acquisitions for organizations, right? So say you have one airline buying another airline.
Yeah.
They're a Cisco shop and the other one's a Palo shop. Like there's also that need for, that cybersecurity mesh architecture, which uses OCSF to have the products talk to each other, so that these organizations can have that. Look, the jury's still out on where this is going to go. I think what's happening here is this indirect, you mentioned, the frameworks from the Cyber Hut, right? So you have that for machine identity and NHI and humans, right? And Simon, the books that you've published as well, right? On those topics. But I think indirectly this M&A is showing us, like, is this going to be the reference architecture? And so what I've seen is, again, going back to this control plane, where, having these bits and pieces be able to just click in, and then organizations going, okay, what's the gap? Runtime. Okay, we've got runtime. You mentioned intent. Like, okay, maybe we need to augment that and have some intent. There are some startups that are coming out of the woodwork that are focused on that. Again, I could see a CrowdStrike or someone grabbing that, plunking it into what they already have, right? So look, I think we'll see where it goes. I think I have a question for you, though. I think we can both agree that machine identity and what Asterix brings here is actually quite strategic, at least in my view, right? Especially if we already know that machines outnumber humans. Agents haven't en masse been deployed yet within enterprises. But when they do, I think we can suspect that there'll be a lot of them. And it's probably a safe statement to say that they're going to be handling some very critical use cases. So the market value that non-humans, machines, and let's just say agents, and I'm already implying that human identity is included here. The market value then of that would be quite high, right?
Yes.
So then why, so this is a challenging question here. Then why did they sell for, I think what was mentioned, for 350 million? That to me just doesn't seem like a lot of money, given the fact that, like, Savient raised 700 million just in December, or was it near $1 billion? Yeah, it doesn't make any sense to me. It seems more.
It's a very right? Interesting thing. This I jotted this down, actually. It's just at the beginning of the podcast, actually. Around, I think we might have touched this last time as well. Around when we talk about mythos, and we're talking about vulnerability identifications exploded, and there's a revolution there. But the other flip side of that, of course, even before mythos, was the vibe coding thing. So let's accelerate through what that vibe coding thing has allowed. It's essentially non-technical people to make stuff, and a lot of it is garbage, or it's whatever. It's got bugs in it, or it's not secure, or whatever. But it allows I guess it's almost, when I was a product manager, the issue was not the capacity of the PM, because we had so many roadmap items and customer requirements and bugs to do. It was obviously, not to disrespect the engineering function, but you only had 30 engineers, and you had thousands and thousands of bugs. So it's sort of spun the other way now, where with accelerating or the sort of accelerant of AI, you can code faster ultimately. So the PM, the product management, or the strategy function, is almost a bottleneck. Well, what should we build? Because we can build things dead quick. And I think we touched on this recently around features are cheap these days. So it's easy to go and build a particular feature, whatever that could be. I'm not going to pick on one and embarrass it, but you can pick on, get an AI agent to do something really small, and maybe in the past that would cost you a lot of cash. Building a connector for an IGA system, for example. So 15 years ago, that's like a 3-month thing. You're going to spend whatever $1,000 a day with a GSI to go and build you a connector to connect to SAP or ERP or some other complicated system. For create, read, update, and delete, and it's whatever. It's going to cost you $100,000 or whatever it's going to be. That's free these days. That sort of thing. You're going to read an API. You're going to create a very simple read, update, delete mechanism, etc. So anyway, the point I'm trying to make is feature parity is rapidly heading to a car crash there, because it's really, really easy to add features into your platform. Now, I just wonder, and I'm not saying this is the case with Asterix at all, but we're starting to see early exits for things. Signal was maybe a good example there. Signal been around for a few years, but they weren't huge. They were exiting for a very large sum of cash. And again, you think about Asterix, the age of them, 2021, 2022.
Yep.
85 million funding. Like, are we looking at an earlier set of exits? Because ultimately, if you look at an Asterix, let's pick on them because they've been relatively successful, got some funding. It's easy for you to look at them and go, I can build the features that you have. So that the sort of intellectual property nugget, if you like, it starts to shrink because you can build features quickly. Now, if you've got a core platform of some sort, it's easier to just add on things at the edge. It's not as easy to build from scratch because you've got to go to market thing is,
of course,
then becomes the bottleneck. You need sales guys and partnerships and the rest of it. But let's just say you have a legacy IGA product, access request, access review, ticking over, whatever. You suddenly go, do you know what? I want to add some Copilot AI assistance with the ChatOps NLP on it. Suddenly, it's just, you can accelerate what it does. And all I'm saying is the likes of Asterix and the capabilities they have, are you going to suddenly see, as you say, maybe a Savient or a CyberArk or a ServiceNow or a whoever, suddenly being able to add in that stuff really, really rapidly. So again, back to this feature differentiation thing, doesn't exist anymore. Is it going to be more about existing customers, go-to-market, partnerships, coverage, and back to your mesh architecture thing? Essentially, how many parts of an architecture can we solve with one vendor or two vendors or three vendors? And those gaps just start to shrink. So anyway, I do wonder if we are going to see a phase now of some really relatively early exits, because is the risk now about go-to-market partnership, not really about the cool tech as it was maybe 3, 5, 8 years ago?
Yeah, I agree with you, because I think I met a good number of vendors when I was an analyst, right on the analyst side, working with lots of these folks when they were in stealth and coming out, and then obviously kept in touch with a lot of the founders at many of these companies, and they're all doing really innovative things, but it's challenging when you're in a market where there's these massive platforms that are well funded and they're very well established and just stuck in enterprise environments. Even if an enterprise is like, hey, I don't know, Palo, or I don't like whomever, right? Like they're likely embedded, and it would be very hard to just take them out over time. So if you are an Asterix or you're an Oasis or you're, one of the vendors in that market, your main differentiation has got to be, innovation, because as we know, it's very difficult for large vendors to innovate for many reasons. And then number two is rapidly demonstrating product market fit. And then showing the trend lines of hey, maybe we didn't reach 100 million in ARR. It's not necessary, but we demonstrated that we can. We just need to have, if we had, the go-to-market, the sales team, and the channel delivery distribution model, we could get that. So I do think that Asterix is going to get that, but I think the vibe coding thing, in my opinion, it is a part of it, connected back to the SaaS apocalypse story, that hurt the market. But it's not that I'm skeptical. I've built a number of apps vibe coded, and I know you have too, Simon. And I was reading a Reddit post this morning. Very quickly, it becomes spaghetti code. And very quickly, these things are just not, I'm not saying, that's the current state of it now. And I can confidently tell you, and I'd argue with anyone over this because it's not really an argument, because I've got the data, is that some people are like, oh, Claude is the best. Gemini is the best. ChatGPT is the best, right? Okay. This is what I can tell you so far on using all of these tools multiple times a day in every aspect of my life. I built a personal trainer in Claude and in Gemini and in ChatGPT over the holidays. And I decided to go with Gemini for many reasons. I won't get into that, but it was fantastic for January. And then they did some update in like February that it almost had a lobotomy. And then it went like, I'm not joking, like every week it would be amazing and the next week it would suck. And then it would be great, it would suck. And it would be great, it would suck. And I noticed the same thing when I'd fiddle around with ChatGPT, same thing. And same thing with Claude. And so what I've noticed is that it is so incredibly dynamic that if you are building your code base off of something that can change that quickly with an update, right, then it's really hard to guarantee your quality of service. That is the big thing that I think is going to be very difficult to solve. And so anyway, just kind of going back to the vibe coding thing. So I think look, perception right now is that if you do that and the market investors, right, the public markets, hey, they like it when you're like, I'm laying off 1,000 people and we're going to vibe code and do this and have one PM to one dev and we're good. The market likes that. But what I can tell you in the last 3-4 months using this stuff day to day, like where I'd be like, what's my nutrition plan for the day and what's this? And it's like acting like it has no knowledge. Like that's what happened. I'm like, how can I depend on this? I cannot. If I laid off a lot of people and I was depending on this, my competitors would eat me alive.
Yeah, I've seen a few posts on LinkedIn about organizations of not necessarily sacked engineering teams, but the reliance on certain LLM labs, and things change. And it's like that was a core part of our business flow or our logistics or whatever it could be. Now, I think there's always going to be scare stories. I think back to your point though, I think as always, you can go faster individually. You can do it like on your own or in a small group. You can go fast, but you can go further in a group. And I think it's exactly the same in this situation here. I think
so
very
good
to nick someone else's cliche, but like it's easy, as you say, it's easy to start something, but then it rapidly becomes just a mess,
100%.
a really fragile
100%.
thing that you can't extend or expand. I mean, you have no idea how it all works because it hasn't gone through the sort of the governance, if you like, of PMing and designing the functions there. So I think, ironically, being slower and being more modular and understanding everything else and using AI in certain more cohesive ways. We're getting back to the old sort of object-oriented programming. It's modular, it's cohesive, you know what it's doing, fine, but don't get into that big spaghetti western. It's almost like AI. The sort of accelerants allow you to make a big monolithic application really, really, really fast. And we've spent 15 years breaking down monolithic applications to get to microservices, and they were modular and floaty and light and all the rest of it. And now it's like, well, we can vibe code our way to monolithic hell because it's so complicated. So
that's the thing. I
do think there's a bit of pain that we're going to face there. But I think specifically on likes of Cisco and others, I think we've talked a lot about identity's moved from being this the dude in the corner looking after LDAP to being this real the fulcrum of security, revenue generation, communities,
100%
clients. Right? It's really important for everything. So it doesn't surprise me Cisco spending a bit more on something which is relatively proven. It's got funding. The category is defined. It makes sense to me. I see it as a logical thing, and time will tell whether they get withdrawn from the market or become part of Cisco or whatever, Cisco NHI, whatever they want to call it. But I think it does. I think it does indicate one, the NHI machine thing is 100% real. People want to buy it. They want to solve those problems.
Big time.
What's it do for those left behind? Yeah, maybe they might be looking for an exit. Maybe, who knows? At some point, I don't think it's the end of acquisitions in that space. I think there'll be more, and I think there may well be a few more this year. But let's change gears a little bit. Just keep the acquisitions thing.
There's still more going on.
Vogue. And there's another one. Let me share this one for those who are watching in black and white or colour. Silverfort, keeping with the X security naming, not to get Asterix and Fabrics mixed up, of course, because they are somewhat different. So
Yep.
Silverfort have, a couple of weeks back, entered into a definitive agreement to acquire a company called Fabrics Security. So, backstory to this: Silverfort's been around for a long time, good funding, good maturity, good number of staff. I guess they were sort of more the on-prem security for the AD sort of enterprise space. Where you're looking at making sure MFA can be deployed to sort of the end-to-end enterprise space, and adding a bit more security around service accounts and privileged and AD deployments there. They then made an acquisition about 18 months ago of a company called Resonate, which was in the ITDR behavior runtime monitoring space, primarily for cloud, actually. So obviously AD historically was on-prem, albeit Silverfort aren't just on-prem. But I guess the Resonate thing gave them that hybrid ITDR identity security play by being able to look, we can do both. We can do SaaS ITDR identity security, and we can do AD extension stuff. So they've been taking over, growing well, and they've recently acquisition of Fabric. So what we're talking about here, so Silverfort's narrative is definitely grounded now on identity security, and they have a thing called RAP, which is their runtime access protection technology, and it's that's sort of their main narrative, and has been for a few years there. And I guess what they're trying to say here is, look, Fabrics, again, relatively new startup, 2-3 years, originally focused on accelerating and improving identity governance style use cases. So essentially using AI to look at access request, access review, access certification, all of the IGA stuff which we've struggled with. And they've had a little bit of a pivot, I guess, Fabrics, and their sort of narrative now is more around this graphing, identity graphing, decisioning sort of engine, which I think is pretty powerful, pretty niche ultimately. But again, taking the identity security component, bolting it in with what Silverfort have, and they've the press release here talk about security data, talking about looking at all of the flexibility in enforcement, but having this decision engine, and I think they call it the identity knowledge graph. There's a nice buzz there, but again, graphing is based on relationships, and again, relationships require data. And I think we've talked a lot in the past about you want to improve your identity decision making by having access to more data, context, ticketing, behavior, sort of historical behavior, what you can do, what you might do, what you should be doing, all of those sorts of signals, and they smashed it together in a graph. A Neo4j graph, I believe. Knowledge, nice term there, to drive authorization decisioning. People, yes, but I think also, as we've touched on in the past as well, sort of agentic access decisioning is a whole different beast. It's a really complicated thing around. You've got just in time. You've got that whole issue of sort of snowballing more permissions, and anyway, so there's a lot to unpick, a lot of new things in that press release for me, a lot of new ideas, new concepts, but again, it seems maybe relatively early. I don't think the numbers are mentioned here, of course, it's a private sale, but they're saying it will allow AI-driven authorization for people and machines, again, machine identity, AI identity. It seems complementary. It seems a relatively smart move from what I can read.
I agree with that. I think what I've liked about Silverfort, and I like the direction of like what Cisco, CrowdStrike, like this is all good stuff that's happening in the identity space. Silverfort, they've always been focused on identity security. Even before identity security was a thing, they were doing identity security. And if you look at some of the principles, another thing I worked on at Gartner before I left was like, defining identity first security and releasing that cool vendors for identity first security, and saying like this is overlaps with IAM, but it's kind of a different thing. And obviously IAM now kind of pulling in identity security, but Silverfort's always been one to be like, we're an identity first security vendor. And I think I'll just pull it back to what we're seeing in the market, Simon. We just talked about Cisco and Asterix, and Signal and CrowdStrike and Vesa and ServiceNow and so on and so on, Apollo and CyberArk. identity is the control plane. And so I think Resonate, Fabrics, right, along with Silverfort and everything they've done across, MFA, bringing it to legacy apps, dealing with the AD stuff, the SaaS stuff now. To me, this just further strengthens their position in being like, we're an identity control plane, identity first security vendor, right? Being able to do runtime stuff, being enabled to do, to look for things like lateral movements and all of these things that are very like threat based. And this is like a huge hole in a lot of the major IAM providers, right? Like, I don't care how some of them are like, oh, we're an identity security vendor. It's like, cool. You're a productivity company that does SSO, which, by the way, SSO is like a gold mine for an attacker. You're not an identity security company. Silverfort is, in my opinion. They to me are like, hey, you want an example of what identity security is? Look at Silverfort, right? Because I think that could come in. The downside is Silverfort, but I think this is something that, they've got really strong partnerships. When you compare them to, say, Cisco in theory has, a lot of telemetry, a lot of data to again, go back to those graphs. We're going to hear that more and more. Where are they getting their data from the graphs? From the enterprise? Are there like third parties? Are there consortiums, right? So that's another area. Like, I think going back to what you're saying with feature parity, in theory, you could develop the neurological system, right? The rails for your graph and have a really, really good, system. But it's going to come down to who has the best data and who can correlate the data. And I think Silverfort's in a fantastic position, but to me, like I said, they're really good definition of identity security vendor that the other IAM providers should take note. And I think that if they have really strong data feeds, that will only strengthen the press release that we said here. But I think I agree with you. Ultimately, this is a really good move for them. And, I think that it's going to get interesting. Runtime keeps coming up over and over again. Control plane, like these are common things that I think this is going to be the next theme for the next probably year and a bit.
Yeah, I think it's funny though. I mean, a lot of this, nothing's new in the sense of his history keeps repeating itself, and it's a lot of the things around authorization in general. So the basic B2E authorization that we did 20 years ago, PDPs and SAC and all this sort of stuff. It's become more relevant, if you like, again, because AI isn't necessarily creating new problems. It's just amplifying the weaknesses that potentially have already existed. Data security being one, access control being another. Horrendous issues we've had around embedded authorization logic within apps themselves and APIs. Like, I think it's always in the OWASP top 10. I don't know whether it's number 2 or 3 or whatever it is this year, but it's a huge problem. And I think the AI thing is just amplifying this around the need for just in time, accelerating your governance around access requests. But suddenly you're doing this stuff at the speed of light, not just for 1 or 2 identities, but for what is probably going to be the bulk of your identity taxonomy is going to be NHI and agentic over the next decade. So it's suddenly become front and center. And yes, you've got the existing authorization providers, whatever, Axiomatics disappeared into Leonardo, you've got Plain ID, you've got a few others, you've got Reva, which is a new one, Reva AI emerged, ironically from some of the ex-Saving guys there who have come out and built a human and NHI agentic authorization platform runtime. So there's a lot happening in the authorization space. And the interesting thing about the Silverfort stuff here is they're not just talking about enforcement, which I think they haven't said it's commodity, but you can tell there's an emphasis more about the decision making, not on the enforcement. 8 years ago, OPA, Open Policy Agent, it was all about taking the decision point stuff and making it more distributed, because enforcement was a problem around how do you do microservices, how do you do infrastructure, latency issues around you don't want to go back to the mothership, big old-fashioned PDP somewhere, and can Simon access this or can this service account access this? It's too slow, so it ended up being more distributed. Now, that's suddenly become the sort of architectural design pattern, if you like, whereas decision, I guess the logic there isn't going to be reliant on static policies. In the old days, it used to be subject, object, actions, Simon, this file, read, write, execute, whatever. Then we overlaid that with a bit of context. But rapidly, those policies just become an absolute nightmare. They become too fragile, too big. Policy explosion instead of role explosion. And I think this decisioning control angle, I think, is going to be a bit of a battlefield. And I think it isn't. You're going to have to use AI essentially to develop what in essence is the policies. There won't be policies. It'll be decision logic. And I think that's the subtle difference here. You're going to be able to look at behaviors and infer what should Simon be doing. And what you don't have a list of policies. It's an engine essentially which you can query against with obviously the LLM behind it to help make runtime decisioning. And that links into intent around yes. Simon should have read access. Should he have it now? What's he doing with it? What did he do with it? What will he do with it? All of those much more nuanced questions, not just allow or deny. So you are going to need data. Back to your point, you're going to need signals. You're going to need data. Where's it going to come from? Historical behavior, comparison to others, self-optimization, guardrails, so to be able to look at ingress and egress, filtering there, maybe prompt injection stuff, maybe handling the same platform or maybe in a separate guardrailsy sort of platform, who knows. But I think this context-driven decisioning is a really smart one. It's a really interesting area. And again, back to the platforms thing, I think you are going to see one or two different vends here attacking this problem.
Reverse, it is getting messy.
Sure. P0, who they sort of originally did Cloud PAM, they're also talking about authorization decisioning. So there's a lot happening around access control. And just final comment, back to the identity security thing. Again, how does this help MITRE ATT&CK? Or how do you bolt into the MITRE ATT&CK TTPs? Because again, back to your point, there's no point saying you do identity security if you actually are an identity governance player, or you do, provisioning or automation or MFA. It's like, where do you sit within process injection or within post-auth, privilege escalation, and all that stuff, which the bad guys are doing day in, day out, and the likes of MITRE ATT&CK help you to identify. So it's an important thing.
I was just going to say, no, I mean, I think, Simon, that's all amazing. Like, I totally agree. And then when you kind of go back to the history of like the policy agent and PDPs and like all this needs to change. And one common term that you brought up multiple times, and even on, I think, our last podcast, was intent, right? So I think that's where it has to go. Like, we have to still do all the other static. I would just split it up very simply, right? And I always picture, like, if you're presenting this to a board that doesn't have the curse of knowledge like we do, and a lot of our audience, but it's like there's static and dynamic, right? So identity and a lot of security has been a lot about static, and dynamic, right? The birth of ITDR and XDR and EDR. But I think we know that, again, I don't want to go down this rabbit hole, but if we connect back to our mythos conversation, you're right. It doesn't do anything that's different per se, but what it does is it brings like massive ramifications and pressure to scale and response. And one thing we already know in the EDR, XDR world is that we try to reduce that mean time to response. You still need to respond to it. So if we break that down into 2 points, one, it's a game of literal cat and mouse, right? So now you have like mythos, and that concept is going to bring a lot of pressure to the notion of response, mean time to response. But then what is the response, right? So all of these things are going to have to change. And I think by layering in intent, it's not going to be a silver bullet. I think we can agree on that. But I do think that it will actually, there'll be probably a lot of stuff that it can reduce. And I think it'll be, punched probably well above its weight as in terms of cybersecurity value, because even as MITRE, we discover new TTPs. If we know what a good intent is, if something is bad, we can cut that out. If something is anomalous intent, like we just don't have a pathway for it because it's unknown, well, then we treat it as negative, and we just then we have to like authorize it and go through certain things to get it through. Because again, to me, if we go back to Silverfort, and in theory, what the other platforms have done, your Ciscos, your Palos, in theory, if there's that whole notion, you can have that engine, as you mentioned, at your control plane that can span your human, B2C, B2B, your machines, and then your agents. In theory, we could get that way, but I do think we're going to need all those components. So runtime is the exciting thing at the moment. I think intent is going to be that next thing, but it's going to require graphs. It's going to require the data and everything. So I'll stop there. I think overall, these are both really good acquisitions that are net positive for the industry, net positive for the acquirers and the acquiree. That's right. Anyway,
the ones who get the cash. No, that's fine. I think there's always. I always when I wrote the second book about identity security, there's two big pillars in there really. One was attribution, one was intent. Those are the two things which we have to solve for both people and software, aka agents and machines. And attribution is slightly easier because we have at least the concept of biometrics and we have inherence and whatever. It's a relatively well-known design pattern. So you take that design pattern and you say, well, okay, what's the equivalent biometry for an NHI or an agent? And there's some good stuff there around process attestation and around be able to validate and verify information around the process from a third party, and you can then give it a credential, but then you look at behavior and bind that credential, whether it's a certificate or whatever, to do that, which is good. But then the really interesting is intent, and what does that really mean? How does it differ from behavior? And I think there's definitely probably a bit of confusion there as that develops. But the analogy I sort of workshop out when I talk about this is being able to spy the lie. And by this, I mean, in the physical world, we're pretty decent at being able to spy the lie. So we're talking about an impersonator, we're talking about social engineering, we're talking about the guy who dresses up like a cop, but you sort of know he's not a cop because he doesn't behave correctly, or maybe his badge doesn't look right, or maybe his way of interacting with you doesn't give you confidence that he's actually a policeman or a policewoman or whatever. So you have all of your psychological intuition there, being able to look at non-verbal signaling and be able to look at someone and go, oh, well, give me the ick, or your gut instinct, as you'd say. And I think we're getting better at being able to do this in the digital setting. We talk about fraud in the B2C space, and we talk about different signals there, and bot, human, friend, or foe. You can identify a bot, whatever, crappy user agent, staticky stuff. Even some of the heuristics can be subverted there by a bot. But we're sort of quite good at looking at that. But I think this intent angle is going to take this another direction more. And one final thing I'll add, I think this concept of decisioning, I mirror what you will say there. I think you take the concept of that, and I think that will get embedded into a whole host of end-to-end processes, right the way from identity acquisition, so the identity creation time, IDV, authent, obviously, authorization, access, you have decisions everywhere. So that concept of a decision engine is going to get pushed everywhere. And how you design a decision engine is going to need data, behavior, historical, external threat intelligence, internal risk data. And I think that used to be like a pipe dream, but I think we're probably several years, maybe I want to say 5 years, but several years away from that. I think that is really where I think the industry may well stabilize a little bit. I
don't want to create I know we should add, I'll just make a very quick comment. No, I think you're right, because I think if we look at what's happened with fraud, and then that whole notion of, user behavior entity analytics into ITDR, and, pick your acronym and focus on use cases, right? But in the fraud world, where it's credit card or transaction, we're pretty good. We're not perfect, but I mean, I don't remember the last time I had to call my credit card company to tell them where I'm traveling. They're pretty good at knowing that, and trying to bring that into the, say, the enterprise workforce, so on and so forth. But what is very apparent, because I've done a lot of research here, is the models, Simon, that you were mentioning, the bot, friend, foe, all of these things. It's like, we used to just assume if it was a bot, very high, good percentage that it's going to be doing something malicious, right?
Yeah.
But as we move into this new world, especially with consumer AI browsers, as we've talked about some time ago, actually just talked to an old colleague at Gartner, and they were saying, look, enterprise agents, like they're growing, but we haven't seen any organization that's deployed enterprise agents en masse. But what the concern is, because there's no enterprise control, is consumers like David and Simon using an AI browser to just like comb the web to find whatever product you want. I talked to a large retailer in the US and they're like, no, we want to own that whole experience, right? So like you go to buy a pair of pants and at the bottom it says, oh, you might also like these sunglasses or this or this. It's like, if you have an agent that just goes to the website and buys what you need, there's no experience, right? That changes everything. So I think we're entering this whole world where even when, Simon, you mentioned those models, the legacy stuff, there's bits and pieces I think that are good of those like threat models, but TTPs and all this other stuff are going to change. And I think the identity vendors that map better to MITRE, that actually like productize it and put it into that control plane, into that engine, as you mentioned, and, cover intent and cover attribute, like all the stuff that you mentioned in the book, spot on. Anyway, excited to unpack this more with you over the next several weeks, and we'll see what else.
It's a 100%. Not all bots are bad, It's that's a difficult thing, and not all humans are good, and it's that blurred thing where we're definitely entering this. And I know we touched about this recently about the B2C agent thing. I think that's a really difficult thing, that, because you're going to break that personalized experience thing, and there's some really difficult things to unpack there. I think it's in some respects in my head I'm thinking, does that, I'm not going to talk about this now because we'll be on for another hour or so, but does that actually aid the privacy of the B2C customer, because you suddenly have this ephemeral buffer in between them, and it's not tracking you, it's not doing your stuff, it's acting on your behalf. It's going to, as you said, buy my airline ticket, but when it's done, it's done. And you know what I mean? It's almost back into this pseudo-anonymous world. And privacy, is it going to enable privacy? Back in the day, you had these pairwise identifiers in OAuth 2 and OpenID Connect, where you wouldn't have the relying parties track the same person and stuff. So anyway, that's probably another.
That's a big. Honestly, I'll just leave it. We can unpack it next week.
I think that's one we definitely should revisit, though. I think we should.
It can do both. Because I'm a heavy user of them. These AirPods I have here were bought purely on using an agent. I can talk about that next week because it was a Black Friday sale that should have been shut down, but the provider honored it because my agent found it. It can do both. I think it can help with privacy, but I think it can also be awful as well. But let's talk about that later.
Oh, I do. As always, we sort of start on one thread and
spawn
thread a million others and blast our CPUs into oblivion. As always, thanks for taking a bit of time out. I think acquisitions are always fun. I mean, we are sort of guessing a little bit as to where these companies will end up. But I think, as you say, I think it's good for the industry. I think it's good to show that there's an exit, I think, for some of these startups. I think, maybe 10, 15 years ago, a lot of startups, and they still do, dive bomb. And maybe they're too early, or maybe they just don't get the go-to-market traction. But I think now there's a lot of awareness, a lot of avenues for startups to go out and scale and be acquired or partner and do other stuff. So, as you said, I think that's a really powerful thing. We'll see how they, I guess, embed into those companies. I do think there will be more acquisitions, as always, certainly in the NHI agentic space over the next 6 months for sure, and maybe a few more in this orthogonal security area as well. So, Dave, thank you for taking a bit of time out and sharing your wonderful insights. This has been episode 73 of the Analyst Brief podcast. Thank you for listening wherever you are in the world. Do get in touch, as always, with your comments and questions. If you do have any on any of the podcasts, we do get a few questions in. Try and weave some of the topics into what we talk about. Privacy is always a good one, which I think we'll definitely revisit that, I think, in the coming weeks and months. But thank you for listening wherever you are in the world, and we will see you next time.